Prophecy update. We talk each week about this. This week we're going to look about how to look at prophetic passages, because sometimes they can be a little bit confusing, and we'll explain that in a moment. But we have this convergence of events, these things, all these things kind of coming together at one time. Economic, geopolitics, the alignment of the nations, apostasy in the church, false teaching, call for a one world leader. You hear more and more. All of these things are part of the prophetic pattern that Scripture lays out for us to be watching for, and as we see these things happen, to be waiting for the return of Jesus Christ. Here's an interesting chart. This chart starts in 2007 and goes up through today, and this is the gold purchase, physical gold purchases by the nation of China. Now, what are they doing? There is a move on the part of a number of nations to get rid of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. That will have a major impact on us if this does in fact happen. I only bring it along to you to be prepared. Part of the problem is we've created some of our own problems. This is from the front page of the New York Times, either yesterday or today, talking about a couple of economic problems. First is, it says, hey stars, be nice to the stagehands, you might need a loan. And what they've done, they found, how many of you ever been to the big Christmas show at Radio City Music Hall? Okay, the big Christmas spectacular with everything, camels and the Rockettes and the tin soldier thingy, all that stuff. And yes, I went one time. Do you know what the average stagehand at Radio City Music Hall makes? $50,000 a year? $400,000 a year. That's why they make more than the actors. And if you've ever taken the backstage tour, if you're ever in New York, take the backstage tour at the Metropolitan Opera. I'm not an opera guy, but that's one of the most fascinating tours you can ever take. Now, this one over here, police salaries and pension push California City to the brink. Desert Hot Springs. I was there with Eric Barger and Bill Salas. Last year we played a golf course there. And the city is having financial trouble. The average person that lives in Desert Hot Springs, it's across the freeway from Palm Springs, makes $31,000 a year. The problem is what they've promised the police officers. The city is bankrupt. They'll run out of money by April this year. What do you think the average police salary is in Desert Hot Springs? $177,000 salary and benefits. When they retire, they can retire at age 50 with 30 years of service, and they get 90% of their highest 2 years average. This is not sustainable, people. People that make an average of $31,000, you can't fund these kind of pensions.
Are they union?
They're union. It's public union problem all over the country. It's less of a problem here in Ohio, but California is particularly bad. I've had a friend, he's my age, he's been retired for 6 years, pulling down about $125,000 a year. Retired at age 53. It's great if you can find it, but the cost of funding average pension in California is, put money aside today, you'd have to put aside $2 million per employee, public employee. Things are out of whack. So that's sort of where we are. So average salary, $31,000 a year for the people. Police salaries, that's down this. Another problem that we have is this MRSA and these type of things, that these are increasingly used to be confined to the hospital. That's part of the reason why if you go into the hospital, I mean, they could do major surgery, it seems like, on an outpatient basis now. They don't want to keep you in the hospital because of what they call nosocomial infections, because the drug-resistant bacteria in the hospital, but now these are showing up outside of hospitals. and there are no antibiotics to treat them by and large. If there are antibiotics, it's a problem. And this is what I think the Bible talks about, that there will be these epidemics, plagues in the end times. Whether this is part of it, I don't know. I don't want to, can't be dogmatic about it, but it's happening. An interesting thing about science, what they found is, the DNA, and DNA is incredibly complex, and DNA probably stands by itself as a reason why evolution just can't be true, that all of this information should be precisely encoded on the DNA just as it needs to be, in the order that it needs to be, and that it self-replicates and all this stuff. That people believe that this happened without a designer and by chance, make a leap of faith that, frankly, as a Christian, I don't know that I could make. They believe in the lie so much that they're willing to do that. Well, now what they found is not only is there a language in the DNA, there's actually underneath that, there's another language that encodes what the DNA does. And listen to what these scientists say about this. This is from a scientific journal. One long understood, describes how proteins are made. That's the language. While the other instructs the cell on how genes are controlled. One language is written on top of the other, which is why the second language remained hidden for so long, a university release said Thursday. The fact that the genetic code can simultaneously write two kinds of information means that many DNA changes that appear to alter protein sequence may actually cause disease by disrupting gene control programs or even both mechanisms simultaneously. In other words, all the promise of we're going to have this gene therapy and everything's going to be great, what they're saying is, well, we don't know what it's doing to the other language. It's also responsible for how the cell operates. And this is much more complex than what we ever said. These new findings highlight that DNA, and this is what one of the scientists says, these new findings highlight that DNA is an incredibly powerful information storage device which nature has fully exploited in unexpected ways. There's a person who's made an incredible leap of faith. How can blind nature have created a language code, one on top of the other, within the cells of your body, and it's taken top flight scientists, thousands of them, years and years and years to find out that the second language even existed. Another thing is this marriage thing. This is days of Noah, days of Lot stuff that we're seeing. A Utah judge essentially issued an opinion that will effectively undermine the polygamy laws in Utah. Now, people who are in favor of traditional marriage, one man, one woman for life, have said that once you break down the barrier and you make it same sex, and it's just people who love each other and want to be committed to each other, there is no rational basis for then saying, you can't have polygamy. And people say, that will never happen, that'll never happen. Well, here it is. In the same year that the Supreme Court in June strikes down, or July strikes down, some of the underpinnings of the constitutional provisions that have been enacted around the country to protect traditional marriage, here it comes. Jonathan Turley, who you may have seen on some of the Fox things, this is what he says. It's true that the Utah ruling, he's a left-wing law school professor, which is kind of redundant in a way. There are some conservative ones. I've met them. I had one in law school. It's true that the Utah ruling is one of the latest examples of a national trend away from laws that impose a moral code. Do you hear that? Away from laws that by the way, the coming world ruler is described as what? The man of lawlessness. You see plenty of that in our geopolitics today. There is a difference, however, Turley writes, between the demise of morality laws and the demise of morality. This distinction appears to escape social conservatives nostalgic for a time when the government dictated whom you could live with or sleep with. But the rejection of moral codes is no more a rejection of morality than the rejection of speech codes is a rejection of free speech. Our morality laws are falling, and we are a better nation for it. This man is a fool. The case was never about the recognition of multiple marriages, the Utah case. He was the attorney for this man and his wives. The case was never about the recognition of multiple marriages or the acceptance of the religious values underlying this plural family. It was about the right of consenting adults to make decisions for themselves and their families. Judge Clark Waddup, a conservative George W. Bush appointee, ruled that the criminalization of cohabitation clearly violated the Due Process Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Across the country, the era of morality codes is coming to an inglorious end. This year, the Supreme Court struck down part of the Defense of Marriage Act, barring the federal recognition of same-sex marriage. And this week, the New Mexico Supreme Court and another federal judge in Utah struck down the ban on same-sex marriages in those states. So the tide has turned, and these are parts of the decisions from the New Mexico, the Utah on the left, the New Mexico on the right cases. In the New Mexico case, the judge said this: the plaintiffs are seeking access to an existing right, not the declaration of a new right. In other words, it's been there all along. We just haven't recognized it. It's nothing new. All you people, all you social conservatives, all you religious people who think that this is important for the proper functioning of society, get over it. This is what the Bible predicted would happen in the end times, that we would see. Listen to this next guy. This is MSNBC alert, okay? So here's Eric Dyson, a professor at Georgetown University, a Catholic university, talking about Christians and that type of thing.
What do you think of this attempt to recruit, essentially, Rosa Parks? Because this is something that has been done before on the right. Like, any time that something they say is taken as offensive by African Americans or taken as offensive by the LGBT community, you get, well, Martin Luther King Jr. would have been on our side, or Rosa Parks, or Phil Robertson is the next Rosa Parks. What do you think of that as a tactic?
I mean, first of all, it's scurrilous, but it's the same as using Jesus and making Jesus co-sign all of this bigotry here. Jesus was a Jew around whom a religion was made. So the anti-Semitism of many of the Christians is ironic to begin with. And then secondly, the gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual stuff, look through the Bible. There's a lot of interesting things. The same men who will stand up in the church of all men, I put my God, Jesus, over all women. I love him more than I love her. Do you really? That sounds interestingly homoerotic to people who are outside your religious traditions. I'm not suggesting it is, but I'm suggesting that there are some very interesting, subtle narrative tensions within the Bible itself and within Christianity beyond that. But to use Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and every other black person you can think, my good friend Jimmy down the street who didn't find a problem when Negroes were being happy, I mean, to use them as test cases for their own bigotry is, again, to ratify the ignorance upon which bigotry rests. And it's
enough, huh? Again, I'm not suggesting this, but I'm going to say it anyway. This is a typical argument. It's bad argumentation. It's foolish. It doesn't make any sense. But this is accepted in many, many places, particularly in our public universities. And remember, Georgetown is a Catholic school. But this man teaches that. And he would have the audacity to say that about people. I mean, does he not understand the difference between phileo, agape, and eros, the word used for love in the scriptures? Obviously not. Obviously not. But he can get on TV and he can say it. Here's what some people, Barbara Walters talking about one of her people of the year. You'll see who this is.
You have interviewed every president of my lifetime. Why is Obama facing so much opposition now? Why is he struggling so much to really fulfill the great flame of ambition and excitement that he was elected on originally in 2009?
Well, you've touched on it to a degree. He made so many promises. We thought that he was going to be, I shouldn't say this at Christmas time, but the next Messiah.
The world's looking for it, friends. Okay? The world's looking for it. This Pope this week, Man of the Year, calling on atheists and Christians to work together for world peace. This is typical of what's going on, is to get everybody's focus on the here and now and not the soon returning Jesus. So even in a group that claims to be Christian, and we can talk about that, the Roman Catholic Church, they don't want to focus on the coming return of Jesus Christ. They want to focus on making peace now. And the Bible talks about what happens when they say peace and safety. Here's something that Egypt did. Egypt declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terror organization. It would be nice if our government did the same. At least certain people in our government who seem to have an affinity for the Muslim Brotherhood, putting people in their office. This is the war in Syria. This continues to be a problem. It's blurring the lines of borders in the Middle East. We know that about 1/3 of Syria is displaced either internally or has actually left the country. It's estimated by the end of 2014 there will be over 4 million refugees living in countries bordering Syria. The largest, second largest, or third largest city in Jordan now is a refugee camp. Similar things, 1 million refugees estimated now live in Lebanon. This is destabilizing governments all over the Middle East. This comes out of, this is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, how things were divided up. You can see Syria was kind of right in the middle of that. And these lines are being blurred, and this is the dark areas, dark green areas are Shia, the lighter green areas are Sunni, and there's a civil war going on between the Syria, the Shia and the Sunni, and this is a problem. This is what some people call the Sunni or the Shia crescent, where the radical Shia Muslims, who strongly, the Sunnis believe in a coming Mahdi, but so do the Shia Muslims, but they seem to be gaining more and more power through this war because the Sunni factions are all fighting among themselves within Syria, but the Sunni factions, Hezbollah and Lebanon, and the different ones in Syria seem to be united. Yesterday, a former ambassador who was opposed to Hezbollah was murdered in a bombing in downtown Beirut. At the same time that this is going on, Caroline Glick wrote this a week ago, The Left Against Zion. The American Studies Association, an organization of university professors, has condemned Israel. Listen to what they says. Whereas the American Studies Association is committed to the pursuit of social justice, that's something that you hear even in the church quite a bit, to the struggle against all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, discrimination, and xenophobia, and to solidarity with aggrieved peoples in the United States and the world. Which side of the political spectrum do you think these people come from? Whereas the United States plays a significant role in enabling the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the expansion of illegal settlements and the wall in violation of international law. It's not, folks, it's not. As well as supporting the systemic discrimination of Palestine. What they said was, we can't have anything to do with people involved in education, universities in Israel because they discriminate against Arabs and Palestinians. By the way, I don't know if you saw the other news this week, that one of the top graduates in one of the leading medical schools in Israel, Palestinian Arab, Muslim, that lives in Israel. So much for that argument. DEPCA file this week. The Obama administration is preparing to settle scores with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for his campaign against U.S.-led nuclear diplomacy with Iran by holding him to blame for the impasse in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. This is unbelievable that that would occur. And DEPCA says Netanyahu has three problems. Iran, the enrichment continues despite this so-called agreement that our administration has touted. The higher powered, faster centrifuges that allow faster enrichment to a higher grade are in place and operating now in Iran. And they're also building this Arak heavy water plant. If Israel destroys that after it becomes operational, it will be an environmental disaster because of the release of radiation. It will be on the order of something like Chernobyl or the thing in Japan. Another thing is a possible new Palestinian intifada. A person working near the Gaza border this week was killed by a sniper. There have been multiple attacks, stabbings, bus bombings, things going on in Israel. And while nobody will say it, it certainly sounds like the beginnings of another intifada. And the other thing that Netanyahu faces is that the U.S. government, at least our administration, is actively undermining Israel's government. In fact, this week, the Obama administration said this to the IDF generals. They're going out saying, look, the security plan proposed by John Kerry and Barack Obama does not work because it does not allow us to provide for our own security in the border, the eastern border of Israel along the Jordan River. We won't be able to prevent terrorists from crossing that border. And if you've ever been to the Jordan River, there was probably a time in my life, if I got up enough ahead of steam, that I could probably get over most of it, because it's just a trickle in some places. So it's not effective. It's not like the mighty Mississippi or something. It's not even like the mighty Olentangy. It's much, much more insignificant in terms of that. This article says the Americans are attempting to convince the government of Israel to accept the security arrangements for the Jordan Valley. But in order to do that, they are trying to hitch up Israeli opinion leaders, mainly opinion leaders from the defense sector. Martin Endike, the American delegate to the negotiations, and his team met in recent days with IDF generals. Those who were present at the meetings understand that the idea is if you support the plan, then go to the media and be interviewed and respond, because they have the impression that the Israeli public has doubts about the subject. This conference took place. This is a joint Evangelicals for Social Action, as we convene a conversation with followers of Jesus from Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. on the theological and practical issues that work in the Holy Land. This is a group that does not recognize the right of Israel, Jewish people, to the land. One of the people who writes for this, well, this is an article about Impact Holy Land, the conference that took place early December. While most presenters spoke broadly of peace, love, and reconciliation at the Fellowship Hall of Historic Friends Center in the heart of Philadelphia was lined with pro-Palestinian activists pushing books on Israel as an apartheid state and hoping to enlist people for the latest Boycott, Divest, Sanction, BDS campaign. However, it was clear from both the event sponsors and most participants that the event was largely designed to encourage Christians to focus their attention on Palestinians who are suffering under Israeli occupation and ignore the Palestinians who are suffering from fellow Arabs. The rejection of any equivalency between the suffering of Jews, both historically and currently, and the suffering of Palestinians was explicit. Palestinian lawyer Jonathan Kutab forcefully remarked, there is no equivalency. There is the occupied and the occupier, the oppressor and the oppressed, the powerful and the powerless. In addition to the expectation placed upon the Messianic Jewish Church, there was the expectation, and by the way, that church is growing very rapidly, which I believe is another sign of the end times. As God turns back towards dealing with the Jewish people, more Jews saved in the last 25 years than in the prior 19 centuries. In addition to the expectation placed upon the Messianic Jewish Church, there was the expectation that one could avoid labels, politics, theology, and narratives and have a serious conversation about solving the conflict. Speaker after speaker proclaimed their desire to move beyond labels and theologies, except ones that disparage Christian Zionism and dispensationalism and build broad relationships. And one of the participants in that conference was Lynn Hybels, wife of Willow Creek founding pastor Bill Hybels. And on her blog, she wrote this. I want you to figure out where she's coming from. Of course, she supports this Palestinianism. And she says this, in 2010, I spoke at the first Christ at the Checkpoint Conference in Bethlehem. I gave a talk. It's all about Jesus, a personal journey. I chose that title because my engagement with the Holy Land was a very personal attempt to follow in the way of Jesus. I had been spending considerable time in the region and was brokenhearted by the suffering that resulted from ongoing and often violent conflict. I believe that what Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs needed most was to see Jesus incarnated in his followers in the Holy Land. I came to Christ at the checkpoint with the desire to encourage and lift up Christians in the Holy Land. And then she goes on to relate a very disturbing conversation that she had with a Messianic Jewish theologian who said that she was confronted her and said she's violating Scripture by supporting this. As she says, it was a very awkward and disturbing conversation. And she goes on to essentially say, well, what they ignore is the fact that this is from Christian Science Monitor this week, a Christian exodus in the Middle East. Christians are leaving all the countries in the Middle East because they're under attack by Palestinians. Commentary Magazine this month has a number of articles. More Christmas lies from the Palestinians. This week we saw people like Abbas saying Jesus was a Palestinian. But the people at this conference never call them on that lie that they perpetuate. And the question from Commentary, which is a Jewish-oriented magazine, is why do Christians tolerate this kind of nonsense? Why do people not see what is going on? And why don't they? Well, one of the reasons is they have no understanding of Bible prophecy. They don't understand that the land of Israel is prophesied by the Old Testament prophets. This is a picture of the founding of Tel Aviv a little over 100 years ago. There was nothing there. Mark Twain wrote a book, American Abroad, I think, or something like that, where he said, there's nothing here. The country is devastated. It's poor. There's nothing growing here. And there wasn't until the Zionist movement came and they've transformed the land. And now where you go, you see, I believe the number I've heard is over 1 billion trees have been planted in Israel in the last 100 years by the Zionists who came back to rebuild that country. And then this is one of the Palestinian leaders saying, who are the Palestinians? This is from Memory TV a couple of years ago. It says, brothers, half of the Palestinians are Egyptians and the other half are Saudis. And so there's this belief. Moses was a Muslim who led Muslims in Exodus from Egypt. That's what they say on Palestinian TV. So Len Hybels concludes, for some of the writers, that peace could conceivably be manifested to a degree anyway in the two-state solution that is being discussed in current peace talks. For others, that vision of peace is a time far in the distance when Jesus' kingdom is here in fullness. We know which one the Bible teaches. But what strikes me as critically important, and look at how she's very critical of this, that people with different theological perspectives who are willing to look at reality honestly and think carefully can envision Jews and Arabs living peacefully and equally as brothers and sisters. She has a conclusion there that if you believe that the Jews have a right to the land, you might be a dispensationalist, you believe Israel is important in prophecy, you are the problem. And this is typical of the way the left argues. I won't go into this. This is a report from the it's either the Presbyterian, one of the mainline publications, talking about the fact that people that believe that the Jews had a right to the land are really the problem. And they're the ones who led to this problem, okay? Now look, how does this all fit into Bible prophecy and the scripture and that type of thing? It's interesting that in Matthew chapter 2, it talks about, well, let's look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born of the King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together the chief priests and scribes, he inquired of them whether the Messiah was to be born. And they, the chief priests and scribes, said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And they cited an Old Testament passage. But look at what it says here. It says that Jesus has come the first time. Herod is troubled by the news, and all Jerusalem with him. That's a stunning statement. For 2,000 years, the Jews had been carefully prepared by God as a special people through whom the Messiah, The salvation of the world, of the Gentile and Jew alike, would come into the world and be sacrificed. The feast were organized around showing the different comings of the Messiah and the different ministries that he would perform. The prophets spoke about it. Jesus, when he was crucified, remember the night he walked to the Emmaus, and he gave a couple people an Old Testament Bible study about how all the Old Testament scriptures speak of me. So for 2,000 years, the Jews had been prepared for the coming of the Messiah. And who came to Israel? Magi from the east, people who had probably, undoubtedly, I think, been trained by Daniel about the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And so they knew, and they were looking for the signs and the stars in the heavens, and they saw these, and they came to Jerusalem and said, "Where is the King of the Jews? We know he's supposed to be born now." They had figured it out, and all Jerusalem heard that, and they were troubled. Remember what we say each week. Prophecy is pattern. What happened at the time of the first coming of Jesus will be what is happening at the time of the second coming of Jesus. So the religious leaders and the religious people prepared for 2,000 years were troubled by the news that the Messiah was there. The same thing happens in our time. People are troubled by the news that the Messiah might be coming back again, and that all the signs are lining up to indicate that Jesus is coming back. And people are troubled by that, because what happened at the first coming, learn what happened then, and it will help you understand what's going to be happening at the second coming. People are, by and large, uninterested in Bible prophecy. I don't know how many churches you could drive to around here today that will talk about second coming and that sort of thing. I doubt that there are very many. I'm sure there are some, but the number is increasingly getting smaller. That's why we talk about it here, because Jesus told us that we are to be looking, watching, watchmen, and we're to be prepared, and we're supposed to be motivated by those signs to get out and do the work. That was what Mike talked about in the first hour. Prayer, fasting, sharing the gospel, those sort of things, ministry. Those are important things, but our motivation is the fact that the Messiah is coming back. In 1 John chapter 2, John says this in verse 18, "Children, it is the last hour, and just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they were not really of us, for if they had been of us, they would have remained with us. But they went out so that it would be shown that they are all not of us." And he goes on to talk about the coming of the Christ. And he says this in verse 28, "Now, little children, abide in him, so that when he appears, we may have confidence and not shrink away from him in shame in his coming." In other words, we need to be living holy lives. We need to be prepared. But the church is largely unprepared for what's coming. This is a report on CNN about what's going on in the Central African Republic. An interview between Christiane Amanpour and Samantha Power, the U.S., she's the ambassador to the UN, United States ambassador to the UN. Listen to some of this, and remember that by many estimates, the Central African Republic is one of the most Christianized countries.
Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have listed the most horrendous crimes, the macheteing of individuals, the mass deportation, the execution-style murders of individuals. They're calling it, some are calling it war crimes, crimes against humanity. Samantha, you wrote the book on this, A Problem from Hell. Do you agree that war crimes, crimes against humanity are being committed right now?
Well, let me just underscore how horrific the atrocities have been and give you just a couple examples. We met with one 20-year-old woman today who watched her husband get stabbed to death right in front of her and then covered with kerosene and then lit on fire, literally burnt to a crisp before her very eyes. This was last Thursday. So when I say the situation is getting a little bit calmer, everything is relative. There is still lynching happening. There is still looting happening. What is happening is that the French and the African Union and some remnants of the Central African Republic forces themselves are moving out and gradually establishing patrols and so forth across the country. But the fact that they are doing that does not detract from the fear that people feel, nor from the anguish of having lost the people that they've already lost. And I don't think we even yet, neither we, governments, nor organizations like Amnesty International yet even know the full scale of what has happened here in recent days, weeks, and months. That will be a picture that emerges gradually. But I certainly agree that what appear to be crimes against humanity have been committed. They've been committed not only by the so-called Seleka militia, but also by these Christian self-defense forces.
And so the church there under attack by Muslims. And so what's Church in America doing? Series on Netflix, movie series. Not about the Bible, but using the movie as a theme to maybe talk about some Christian themes. This is a poster I like. Certainty. Of course I'm sure about something. I never question my own doubts. Now in Luke chapter 4, and I'll finish with this because I have more about the Messiah, it's sometimes difficult to understand prophetic passages because the passage will deal with both the first and second coming of Jesus. And it's sometimes hard to divide those out. Let me give you an example of that, and then we'll finish up for today. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus has finished ministry in Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, and he goes to the synagogue in his hometown. This is a representation of it that's been reconstructed. And he picks up the scroll and he opens to Isaiah. What he opens to is Isaiah 61. In Luke, in his passage, in Luke chapter 4, verse 18, he says this. This is what Jesus reads from the Isaiah scroll. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord, or to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is from the ESV. And then he sits down. But what's interesting about that passage is Jesus stopped reading right in the middle of the messianic prophecies that are in Isaiah chapter 61. And you can see here from this that there's a very close relationship between Isaiah 61, verse 1 and 2, and Luke 4, verses 18 and 19. They're essentially the same. But what you don't see is you have to go to Isaiah 61 to get the full brunt of the messianic prophecy is there. And so it starts off, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because this to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And you notice he stopped right in the middle of a sentence, at least what we would consider a sentence. And he didn't say, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they might be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. So what do we take away from this? Jesus recognized that there were some prophecies, and you see this throughout the Old Testament. You see it in Isaiah, you see it in Jeremiah, you see it in Ezekiel. There are things that passages that deal with both the first and second coming of the Lord. And sometimes it's difficult to sort those out. There are sometimes those applications have application to not only Israel, but the church. If you see a passage that says about the people of Judah, that's usually limited. I think it's always limited to the Jewish people, the nation of Israel. But sometimes Israel and the church are treated the same from a prophetic standpoint, that the same things that will be happening to the Jewish people will be happening to the people in the church in the end times. And so, but this is clearly one where Jesus says, okay, look, first coming, second coming. And so when you chart this out, and I like charts, where you look at Jesus' personal ministry, then we have the church starting with his resurrection, the church, really Pentecost, the church age, Then we have something coming up the 70th week of Daniel. We know that starts with the signing of a covenant. And then Jesus returns at the end of that 70th week to set up his millennial kingdom. And so the passage that Jesus read is the first one, the Lord's anointed me to bring good news to the poor and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This was fulfilled, Jesus said, here in his first 3.5 years of personal ministry. We know that from other parallel passages that the day of vengeance of our God will come at the end of the 70th week, near the end of the 70th week. And then it also talks about this passage to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion. And we know that what will happen is that Jesus will return in response to the petition of the Jewish people who are being oppressed by the Antichrist. It says this in Hosea chapter 5, verse 15, and then on into chapter 6. Hosea 5:15. I will return again to my place. Speaking of the Messiah, this is what Jesus did. He went back. Until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face, and in their distress earnestly seek me. Verse 1 of chapter 6. Come, let us return to the Lord. This is the Jewish people. This is what will be going on in the place where they're hiding out, probably in the wilderness of Edom, probably Petra and the surrounding region, which the Antichrist somehow is prohibited from entering. After 2 days, come let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up, that we may live before him. And then verse 11 in Hosea 6, for you also, O Judah, that sort of indicates who it's to, the Jewish people, a harvest is appointed when I restore the fortunes of my people. Talks about Jesus coming back in response to the petition of the Jewish people. And then it says, they'll look on him in Zechariah 12, they'll look on him, those who mourn, as one mourns for a child. And so you see how the prophetic passages all fit together very nicely. But sometimes, admittedly, it's very difficult. We'll talk more about this in the weeks to come as we look at some of the ways that the passages are divided up. And it's hard for us with a Western mindset to understand how the Jewish mindset worked, but I think we get a pretty good understanding of it if we look at these prophetic passages. That's all I have for today. Let's look forward to the return of the Lord